Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. We've pulled up here into early December of 2020. And so as we are sort of into the holiday season now, I thought it would be a good time for us to sort of do an episode where we took care of a couple of, if you will, housekeeping items, also keeping things light. As we know, a lot of our listeners are going to be busy doing other things and may not have time to even pick up a full episode right now. But we have a couple of announcements and a couple of things that I think are relevant. And so today we won't actually be exploring a particular what-if topic, but we will be talking about what's going on with the show. And we have some exciting things to announce and some exciting things to sort of relate. And so we'll begin to do that here right after this break from some of the folks that help make the podcast possible. Be back in a minute. Don and Alexis taking a quick break from the podcast to tell you about some of the folks actually that help make the podcast possible, because it's where we host the podcast, but wanted to let you know about Buzzsprout. So, Alexis, we are now a number of episodes into doing a podcast. What did you know about hosting a podcast before we started hosting a podcast?
Not a lot.
Not a lot for me either. I was an avid listener, but had to dig in a little bit and learn a little bit about the places where I could host. And there's a number of different ways to produce, host, and distribute a podcast. But we landed on Buzzsprout. So what are some of the things you like about Buzzsprout, Lex?
Some of the things I like about Buzzsprout are, because we're not always together. We're together right now, but we're not always together. One of the things it does, it actually sends me an email when an episode is finished processing. So I know it's like, okay, we got a new episode coming out. And I'm sure it does the same for you, so we can always kind of keep tabs on each other and what we're doing with the podcast for sure.
Yeah, one of the things I think I didn't realize or know what our statistical aspect of hosting a podcast was going to look like, but I was very excited, maybe too strong a word, but probably not, to learn early on that we, of course, I knew we got data about the number of downloads per episode and all of that fun sort of thing, but we also get like a map showing where people download from, and that's actually one of my favorite things to go and look at, is to go and see that, you know, we have listeners. We don't have a large number of listeners because we're a very niche podcast, but we have listeners from around the world.
Absolutely. The other thing I like to look at in those stats is it ranks the podcast episodes from the most popular. So I like looking at the list.
Yeah, and we were talking just off podcast before we recorded this little ad here about one of our episodes that is an unusual outlier in terms of how quickly it's risen. And it's interesting to see that sort of thing. We're telling you all this not because we just wanted to tell you about Buzzsprout, but suggest if you've been thinking about a podcast, what could you do?
Check out Buzzsprout.
Yeah, and if you follow the link in the show notes, it'll get you to where you need to get to understand how to put a podcast together, which, by the way, you can do on a very, very, very almost nothing budget coming out of the gate, because we were able to do that as well. And if you happen to follow that link and do that with Buzzsprout, and we'd recommend them because we've had a good experience with Buzzsprout, then we get some of the credit for that. So it helps you get started. As we've said, we don't think of other podcasts as being the competition, particularly in our genre or near our genre. So it's a chance for you to go start and do something and share something that you love.
Absolutely.
I'll just say recently, one of my good friends growing up has started his own podcast about something that is so different from alternate history, I'm not even going to mention it here. But he and I were talking about hosting sites and how easy it was. And I think he wishes he would have checked out Buzzsprout before he did what he did. And so I mentioned that now. It was very easy. By the way, one of the other things that's there, I just want to mention this. If you're concerned about how you get distribution, Buzzsprout does a wonderful job of helping you getting listed on all the various directories. Again, in fact, I've had people that I know that have their own podcasts that are hosted in other sites who have said, how did you get listed on fill in X? And I said, well, that was easy. I just followed the instructions directly there on Buzzsprout. So
I did what Buzzsprout told me to do.
Yeah, and they made it pretty easy to do. And some of them are very easy to get posted on. For example, Apple Podcast is easy to get on, but there are others that are not. And so they help with that. So we would recommend Buzzsprout if you've been thinking about it. And if you do, follow the links in the show notes and you can do it yourself. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. And as I introduced before the break, we're going to be doing some what I'll just call housekeeping items today here on the podcast episode. But I think they're going to be interesting and valuable, particularly to our regular listeners, in terms of giving you some understanding about some of the things that are going to be happening, some personnel-related matters that are going to be happening, but also some other things as well. The first of those announcements, and I'm really excited about this, is many of you have come to know Chris Coppola, who has served as a guest host and contributor to the show on a number of episodes. He now is our most frequent visitor, most frequent guest on the show. Chris has actually agreed to join the show in a sort of a more formal role. We haven't decided what that title is going to be, other than the titles that he sort of already has, one of them being show agitator, as those of you will know who listen to the show regularly. But he's definitely going to be in the form of a regular contributor. So we haven't worked out all the details yet, but probably you should expect to hear an episode that includes Chris at least once a month and maybe a little bit more frequently. And I'm very excited about that. I'm very excited about it for a number of different reasons. First of all, I think Chris brings a lot to the episodes that he's a part of. His knowledge of history and his perspective and take on things I find insightful. I think many of our listeners do as well. I also like the fact that Chris came to us, by the way, that we've talked about. We've grown the community and grown the family here on A Fork in Time, as he came to us as a listener who turned into a guest and is now going to be a regular contributor. And I don't think he's going to be the first one that falls in that mode as we move forward. So on behalf of Alexis and myself, we want to say welcome to Chris. Chris will be on an episode soon. We'll talk about that before that we get into the details of that episode that day. But I hope you'll join me in welcoming Chris to be part of the regular rotation here on A Fork in Time, and I'm really excited about that. One of the other things that we did here recently, if you'll recall, is we actually focused at least one brief episode on what I called the Big Themes Survey. And I want to thank many of you for taking the time to go to the website and respond to that survey and give us some feedback on this concept that I introduced there. That was back in episode 79, about what we had noticed sort of being these recurring themes that tend to happen even when we started a different fork in time, if they're in some of the same general time frames because of the big macro themes in history that tend to go on, how we often found ourselves coming back to the same topics. We gave some examples of that, things that relate to the Reformation, some of the things that relate to the early development of colonial America and the early years of the United States as a nation, and some of the themes that go on through that. And I was just curious to hear back from our listeners if they detected sort of that same thematic trend and how best for us to deal with that here on the podcast. Because while we do start from different specific events and different forks in time, we would often end up covering what seemed like some of the same topics, even if they were being covered from a slightly different perspective. And the overwhelming theme from our respondents was not unanticipated. It did indicate that others believe that there are these big thematic themes, a duplicative statement there, but that they do exist in history. And so the question was how best for us to deal with them. And we got a mixed response on that. Most of our respondents actually said they would prefer that we continue to use the existing format where we focus on a specific fork in time, even if some of those episodes end up exploring some of the same topics because of the time frame or the similar results that can happen from that result because of what's going on in the big themes in history at that time. And so we'll do that. But several of our respondents also said they like the ideas of us occasionally taking sort of a thematic approach to that. And so we're going to mix and match those two formats a little bit as we move forward, particularly into 2021. For the most part, the show each week will look like what you're accustomed to seeing, which is us launching off on a particular fork in time from a particular moment or particular event. That's sort of what the whole concept of the show was about from the beginning. But we may mix in the occasional, once a quarter, once every couple of months, sort of thematic show that talks about maybe a range of forks, 5, 6, 7, or 8 different forks that may all be inside of a particular theme, but seem to share that common theme. So we took the feedback to sort of indicate that most of our listeners want us to keep doing what we've been doing, so we will do that, but we will mix it up a little bit from time to time with the other concept, perhaps throwing in a thematic episode here or there. Now, we may also do something that we've done a couple of times in the past. Hurricane history here in 2020, back in June, was one example of that, where we may take a theme and look at particular forks over the course of 2, 3, 4, maybe as much as a whole month of episodes where we look at different forks throughout history that do share that common theme. And that does sort of tie back to the other part of our survey, which was getting feedback from our listeners on what they thought those big events in history were. And we asked that question a couple of different ways. One of the ways were to ask our listeners to rank sort of from 1 to 5 in terms of what they thought the big events in history were. And it should be no surprise that there was a good deal of overlap inside of that, but also still quite a bit of diversity from the respondents. And then the other thing that we particularly asked was for our listeners to suggest what might be some of the most overlooked yet impactful events in history. And I found some of the answers there to be expected. I found some of the answers there, quite frankly, to be very unexpected, but also very interesting or exciting. And so one of the things that we will be doing in 2021, Chris will be an important part of being able to do this because of some of the areas of history that he has some particular knowledge in and can bring some value as a contributor on those shows. We are going to produce a couple of themed areas of shows, again, sort of topical themes throughout 2021, and I want to introduce a few of those today. One of the recurring themes and or big event responses that we consistently saw in our survey related around the two things I'll call the two I's, innovation and invention. And while we have focused a couple of episodes on particular inventions, for example, I know Alexis did an episode on the printing press on Gutenberg, and we've done others as well. That's actually something that we haven't done as much of because we tend to focus around a historical event in the sense of something that's finite, around a battle or around a birth or a death or something like that actually tends to be a little bit more about persons in history. So we will have a number of episodes in 2021, and probably we actually may invoke a monthly series. In fact, it may be the January series as we're starting off a new year with innovations and inventions. And so there were at least 4 suggestions that actually came in through the big events or through other means. And so we already sort of have, I think, a good host of shows there. Although we, as we will throughout all of this, encourage our listeners to go to www.aforkandtimepodcast.com and give us your show suggestions and your comments and your responses as well, but particularly your theme suggestions or your episode suggestions there. We look forward to those, and we try to incorporate as many of those as we can from our listeners. But certainly one of the themes that we saw and we'll certainly be exploring in 2021 is this idea of innovation and invention. And many of those things go back much further than you think, and some of them are in ways that you might not think of. It's not necessarily the invention of a particular singular technology per se that's at play, but it can be something else as well. One of the other recurring themes in terms of, I know an area that we haven't explored as much as we could or should or will, relates to, I'll generally call it Asian history, particularly Asia Pacific, but more specifically around Chinese history. And so we probably will also do, not perhaps maybe a whole month, or we may not cluster those episodes, but we're definitely going to be more focused in 2021 on some of the big events in Chinese history in terms of how they affect just that region, which is quite substantial. Again, the most populous nation on Earth today, but also how they affect world history as an entire flow. And so one of the things that you'll see thematically coming up in 2021 is a little bit more focus on things that are of Chinese historical descent and some of the interesting what-ifs that we can explore there. Another similar regional type of thing actually is Eastern Europe. Very often we focused on Europe, but normally in the context of war. World War I, World War II, or other types of conflicts, but definitely want to focus more on what I'll just call Eastern European issues. Those are also Russian and Soviet issues. And so that was a recurrent theme also among some of the big themes or the important events throughout history. And so we'll certainly take a look at those. Again, Chris brings some, particularly with his European history perspective, brings some interesting things to the table there. So you'll see that as a little bit more of an emphasis in 2021. And sort of the other big thematic area that was a theme that came out of the survey work and thinking through the different types of things that we want to focus on actually falls more in the area of ancient history. And I have to decide how far back you go, but certainly going back to the time, maybe even predating Greek and even elements of Egyptian and Sumerian breakouts, but certainly going back to things that happen in the BC period of time, before the Common Era. and going back to looking at things that are there. So you'll see that a little bit more flavored. A number, again, of the suggestions that came in through the survey relate to those, and so we'll be mixing those in as we go throughout the course of 2021. So just want to give you a little preview of some of what's going there. If you still think there's something that we missed in terms of big themes or big events and you didn't have a chance to go and actually complete the survey, and that survey is still open via the website. So again, www.aforkandtimepodcast.com, and we would welcome you going and completing the survey, even though we've sort of closed off our first analysis on the results now. It's going to remain open as something that our listeners can take and provide us the feedback on. Just look there for the big themes link on the primary homepage. When you hit it, we'll also include a link in this episode that would take you directly to that. So again, just wanted to give those couple of quick announcements out as we move towards the coming of the new year here, and sort of thinking about our editorial calendar for 2021. Again, the first big announcement, again, welcoming Chris Coppola to be one of our regular contributors and taking more of a regular versus a guest role here on the show. And then some of the things that are coming up as far as topical and thematic trends for the show in 2021. And finally, as we get ready to close out the episode here, I just wanted to take a couple of moments to say something that we do on every episode, but I want to do it just in a special way, particularly coming off the backside of the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States. I wanted to say thank you to our listeners. I was looking at some of our statistical data, where we have listeners from, all of those types of things just earlier in the week, and just wanted to take a moment again to say we appreciate you. We're glad that you found us. We're glad that we have, at least several hundred folks that check in on what we're doing here each week on the podcast, and we recognize that takes some of your time, and we are appreciative of that. I also want to thank those of you that have chosen to contribute to the show by participating through our Patreon page. I would encourage you, if you haven't done so and are capable of doing so and have the desire to do so, all three of those things are important. We would certainly appreciate that. Like Alexis and I have said so many times, the costs of maintaining the podcast are relatively nominal in terms of economic. There is a time investment as well, but your support financially also does help defray those costs. And we know it's been a trying and difficult year in a number of ways for many of our listeners, and we recognize that. But if you haven't had the chance to do that, and it's something you've been meaning to do or wanting to do, we certainly would appreciate it. It's an easy thing to do there on the Patreon page. You can find us at Patreon looking for A Fork in Time, or there's always a link in the show notes and certainly on our website. Last time to plug the website, www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. My other final request in terms of a way that you can help us, because there's ways that you can do that certainly beyond financially, is to help spread the word about the show. So I would encourage you to use social media. We have the links there to our Facebook page. We have the links to our Twitter, the other ways that we actually spread the word out. One of the things I do want to mention is we actually have started posting. Granted, they are only in an audio fashion, but we have started putting the audio from episodes, I guess for about the last 4 to 5 episodes, are now on YouTube. We know that it's not necessarily the ideal format for that platform. YouTube is a video platform, and much better plays as a video platform, but I also know for a number of folks it would just be easier for them to access or listen to the episodes there on YouTube. So just be aware that A Fork in Time, still in its audio-only format, does appear with the release of each episode on our YouTube channel. And so that's another place that you can get access to the podcast. So you can look for us there by doing a search on YouTube, or the links that are there also on the website as well. Just trying to get the word out as well. So if you know somebody who you think might be interested, tell them about the podcast. Give them the gift of A Fork in Time for this holiday season, and it won't cost you anything. And so we would appreciate if you would do that and just spread the word. But again, most importantly, we thank you for your time and your attention. We'll be back next week with a regularly formatted, talking about some type of change in history approach, a what-if episode that looks like the A Fork in Time that you've come to know and hopefully have come to love. We'll be back with an episode that fits that mold next week. Until then, I ask you to be safe and take care. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.